All right, so again, the difference quotient you're going to use in calculus, business calculus, or engineering calculus when you get to the idea of the slope of a secant line. So in that part, when you get, this is not in here, but it's in the next course, not trig. If you're taking trig next semester, you're not going to have anything dealing with the difference quotient. But basically, if you have something like, let's say, this parabola, this quadratic function, so a slope of a secant line, so if I draw a secant line, and a secant line is a line that intersects the graph more than once. So this would be a secant line. And so the difference quotient, when you first start talking about this in business calculus or calculus, the slope of a secant line, so that's a secant line, you're going to find the slope of a secant line. So you're going to find the slope of this line. And the first thing you're going to do is use the difference quotient. So the slope of the secant line is going to involve the difference quotient. So before you get to that point in that course, you need to know how to find the difference quotient. All right, so before we find the difference quotient, I'll talk about the difference quotient. Let's review something that's needed for your next test. Now this review, we did this last week. Okay, suppose that my function f of x is this. It's, let's say, 2x squared minus 3x plus 4. And I want to find, let's say, f of x minus 5. Do you remember how to do that? How do you find f of x minus 5 if your function is given by f of x? Say it again. So where we see the variable x in your function, I'm going to replace it with what expression? X minus 5. So where we see the variable x, you're going to replace it with x minus 5. And you're going to use that idea when we talk about the difference quotient. You're going to use that same idea. So f of x minus 5 then becomes 2 times, so remember f of x was this. F of x minus 5 is going to be a different function. So instead of f of x minus 5 being 2x squared, it's going to be 2 times, and what am I replacing x with? X minus 5, and what must I do to x minus 5? Square it. Minus 3 times x. X becomes x minus 5, and then plus 4. So basically, where we saw the variable x, remember this was x right here in your function f of x. So 2x squared minus 3x plus 4. But those variable x's we're substituting with x minus 5. Now that's not your answer because you got to do quite a bit of work here. So you got to get rid of those parentheses. In that first set of parentheses, it's being squared. Now, are you going to distribute first or are you going to square first? Square. You're going to square first. If you distribute first, it's going to be incorrect. Because remember, you got to use the order of operations. The order of operations says you do exponents before you multiply. So I got to do the exponent first. So go off to the side and figure out what x minus 5 times itself is. So there's a little bit of work you have to do. So x minus 5 times x minus 5. So remember the FOIL method. X times x is x squared. The outer is negative 5x. The inner is also a negative 5x. And the last is a positive 10. And when I combine like terms, this becomes x squared minus 10x plus 10. And remember, this is... Yes, plus 25. Thank you. Plus 25. So that is this, only this part right here, right? Just this right here that I'm circling. But all of this has to be multiplied by what number? 2. All right, so that becomes 2 times this trinomial. And I'm going to go ahead and distribute this right here. Now remember, I could not have distributed here, but I could distribute here. Make sure you know why. So why is it you can distribute here, but you could not have done it here? because the exponent here is 2. The only time you can distribute is if the exponent is a 1. See, that's a 1 right here. So here you can distribute. Now, could I distribute here now?
Yes.
Yes, because that exponent is a what?
1.
A 1. All right, so that becomes minus 3x plus 15 plus 4. And then distributing the 2, I get 2x squared minus 20x, and then 2 times 25 is 50, and then minus 3x plus 15 plus 4. And then combining like terms, that's your answer. So what's the answer? Let's put it in descending order. 2x squared minus 23x, right? And what's 50 and 15? 65, and 65 plus 4 is 69. Yeah. All right, so that's the answer there. All right, let's do one more. Suppose that g of x is this. Suppose that g of x is negative 3x squared plus 5x. Negative 3x squared plus 5x. And you want to find, let's say you want to find g of 2x minus 1. G of 2x minus 1. So again, what are you going to do? Wherever you see the variable x, you're going to substitute 2x minus 1. So I see an x here and I see an x here. So I'm going to substitute those with 2x minus 1. So this becomes negative 3. So all I'm doing now is just plugging in. Negative 3 times 2x minus 1, but that 2x minus 1 has to be raised to what power? The second. Plus 5 times, and then that x becomes what? 2x minus 1. All right, now again, you got to do some work. You got rid of those parentheses. So I go off to the side and I figure out what 2x minus 1 times itself is. So using the FOIL method, see this right here is this. So using the FOIL method, I'm going to get 2x times 2x is 4x squared. The outer, now remember I'm squaring a binomial, so the outer and the inner should always be the same whenever you square a binomial. So the outer is a negative 2x, the inner better also be a negative 2x. And the last, what's a negative 1 times a negative 1? Positive 1. And they combine like terms, we get 4x squared minus 4x plus 1. Now remember, all I found was this. So that's going to be negative 3 times this, right? Now I'm going to go ahead and distribute this 5 here. So that's going to become 10x minus 5. All right. And then now I'm going to distribute this negative 3. So I get negative 12x squared plus 12x. Because a negative 3 times a negative 4x is a positive 12x. And a negative 3 times a positive 1 is a negative 3. And then I have these two terms. And then combine like terms, we have our answer. So that's going to be negative 12x squared. What's 12x and 10x? 22x. And what's a negative 3 and a negative 5? Minus 8. Okay? All right, so quite a bit of work here, but that's going to also be the same for the difference quotient. Difference quotient is going to be a little bit more than that. But you follow the steps, you should be fine. All right. Now, before we go on, so this was, remember, this was a review, because that review is needed for the difference quotient. We'll talk about the difference quotient. So this was number 1 for our review. This was number 2. And let's just suppose that, and it's needed for one of the worksheets, number 3. Let's suppose I want to find, well, let's suppose, first of all, that h of x is this, negative 5x squared plus 6x minus 3. And I just want to find an easy one. I just You want to see what you're going to do with this. What if you would just want to find h of negative x? Say it again? What do you mean by negative 1?
Well, because the x is the coefficient stuff is basically.
Oh, if you want to put a negative 1x, you can, yes. Yeah, but you can put it right just as negative 1x if you want to.
And you just substitute.
You substitute. Yep. So this becomes negative 5 times a negative x squared, right?
Right.
Plus 6 times a negative x minus 3. Now the difference between this one and the previous two was that when I did the previous two, I substituted a binomial. See, these were binomials that I substituted. Here, this is a monomial. So when I substituted this binomial, I had to FOIL this out right here, right? And basically I said x minus 5 times x minus 5. Here, though, what am I squaring? A negative x. What's a negative x times a negative x? Positive x?
Square.
Positive x squared. X squared. So this becomes a negative 5x squared, right? Because negative x times negative x is x squared. And what's a positive 6 times a negative x? And then minus 3. And then combine your like terms, you're done. But are there any terms that are alike? No. So there's your answer. So there's a problem in one of the worksheets, I think, or on my math lab that asks you about h of negative x. So just, that's all you do. That's it. Okay? All right, so let's talk about the difference quotient now. So the difference quotient. Now, I'll give you the formula. You just need to know how to use it. And this formula is going to be important when you take calculus, either business calculus or regular calculus. But here's the difference quotient. All right, the difference quotient. So the difference quotient is going to be f of x minus h, x plus h minus f of x divided by h. So f of x plus h minus f of x divided by h. That's a difference quotient. It does mean something. You have no idea what this means or where it comes from. So basically, when you derive this next semester, it's really the idea of a slope. The idea of slope. But it'll be the slope of a secant line that you're going to talk about this in reference to. So f of x plus h minus f of x divided by h. Okay? So I will give you the difference quotient. You just need to know how to use it. So here we go. We're going to start out with a linear function. It's either going to be linear or quadratic. I won't give you any other function. Now, the one in the test will be quadratic because the one in the final is usually quadratic. So let's just look at a simple one first, though. So it's going to say find the difference quotient. Those will be the directions. Find the difference quotient for, and let's suppose in number 1, I have the function f of x equal 3x minus 7. F of x equals 3x minus 7. I'll find the difference quotient. So for right now, you're going to practice finding this quotient. Remember, quotient means to divide. So notice you are dividing. You're dividing a numerator by a denominator. So you got to know how to do that, manipulate this for next semester. Okay, so you can do it in steps. So notice in your numerator, you have two different things going on. You're subtracting f of x from, not f of x, but f of what? X plus h. And whatever that numerator is, you're dividing by h. Okay? So you can break it down in steps. You need to do this in steps. So the first thing you need to do is always find this part here first. That's going to be the one that's going to be the most work. It's going to be this one right here. All right, so step 1, if you do this in steps, you'll say step 1 is to find f of x plus h. That's step 1. So notice it's very similar to the one we just did, except instead of saying x plus 5 or x minus 6, it's x plus what? H. The idea that we did for these is very similar. So basically, wherever I see the variable x in my function f, what do I substitute? What do I substitute? I can't hear you. Where you getting? No. Okay, come on now. You're not looking at what we did here. Y'all had no questions here. When we did this one and I said find f of x minus h, what did we do? We didn't substitute this into here. We substituted what? X minus 5, where we saw the variable what? X. We substituted 2x minus 1 wherever we saw the variable x. We substitute negative x wherever we saw the variable x. We substitute x plus h wherever we see the variable x. So wherever we see the variable x and I see it here, I'm going to substitute what? X plus h. Same idea. So this becomes 3 times what? X plus h, and then minus what? 7. Now that one is much simpler than the one that's quadratic, because the one that's quadratic, guys, remember, at some point you're squaring a binomial. That's at work right here. But here, am I squaring a binomial at all? No. So what's the next step? One more step and you're done. Distribute. So what's the answer? 3x plus 3h minus 7. You can't combine any like terms, so that's your answer. So for step 1, I should say. That's step 1. So f of x plus h is 3x plus 3h minus 7. Again, it does mean something. It really does. That part of the understanding doesn't come into play until next semester. All right, now with step 1. Remember, all I found, this right here, is only this part here, right? But in the numerator, what must I do to what I just found? Subtract f of x. Do you know f of x? Yes, you always will. That's what you started out with. All right, so here's the next step. You're going to say step 2. Step 2 is to actually do the numerator now. So step 2 will be, well, I need to write what f of x plus h is. So what is f of x plus h? 3x plus 3h minus 7. Then I'm going to subtract f of x. What's f of x? All right, now be careful how you write it. So some of you are going to do this right now, but when it comes time for the test, you won't do this. But some of you are going to write this right now. But be careful. You're not when you look at this, you're subtracting 3x, it looks like, right? But what should I be subtracting? 3x minus 7. So I need to put this in what? Parentheses. So always put f of x in parentheses. Always put f of x. Always put this right here in parentheses. And then what's the next step? Well, even before you do that, get rid of the parentheses. So distribute the negative 1. So I get 3x plus 3h minus 7. What else? Minus 3x plus 7. All right, now, what happens when I combine like terms now? The 3x's cancel out, and the 7's cancel out. They're opposites of each other, so when you add them up, they're 0. In fact, if you look at what's left, what is left? 3h. And that's always going to be true. That's always going to be true when you're dealing with polynomials. These are polynomials, linear function, quadratic function. If you're doing this correctly, every term that doesn't have an h cancels out. Every term that does not have an h cancels out. 3x, there's no h, so there better be a negative 3x somewhere. A negative 7, there better be a positive 7 somewhere. So you're going to notice that when we do the next example of that situation. So 3h just ends up with what? I'm sorry, the step 2 just ends up with what? 3h. Now, what is I found in step 2? What part of the difference quotient have I found for step 2? What part of the difference quotient have I found? The numerator. That's what I want you to say, the numerator. I found the numerator. All right, so step 3 is to now rewrite the numerator. What's the numerator? Whatever you found from step 2, right? What did I find from step 2? Divided by what? H. And then reducing, you found your answer. 3. So now, in the blank, it's going to, remember the difference quotient. So the difference quotient of f of x equal 3x minus 7 is blank. So what is it? 3. That's the answer. So the difference quotient of this function is just what? 3. Now, when you take calculus, you're going to know some shortcuts. You don't have those shortcuts here because it's not calculus. But when you talk about calculus, you're going to do the difference quotient this way first, and then you're going to come up with those rules. There's some shortcut rules that you can use. It saves you a lot of time. All right, let's do one that's a quadratic. That's the one that's going to be the most work. So number 2. Let's suppose that g of x is 3x squared minus 7x plus 2. 3x squared minus 7x plus 2. And directions will say find the difference quotient. Well, first of all, what's the difference quotient formula? F of x plus h minus f of x all over h. All right. Now let's do this in steps. So if you look at what you have kind of 3 things, at least 3 things going on. You got to find f of x plus h. Whatever that is, you're going to subtract this function f. And then whatever that numerator is, you have to divide by h. All right. Now, when we talk about the difference quotient, we talk about the function f, right? But I didn't name my function here f. What do I name it? G. So really, when you talk about the difference quotient, really you're going to, instead of saying f, you're going to say what? G. So you're going to find g of x plus h minus what? G of x divided by h. All right? But for the most part, whenever you look at textbooks, it's always f of x plus h minus f of x over h. Because we tend to always, for some reason, when you first start talking about function notation, we tend to always use the variable f. And that's the one we use the most often. All right, but remember, this is not, my function is not f of x. What's my function? G of x. So when you find a difference quotient, it's the same thing. It's just that instead of saying f of x plus h, you're going to say what? G of x plus h. All right, so step 1. And I think the one in your worksheets are all f of x's. But the step one, remember, is to find what part first? G of x plus h. All right, and that step 1 is going to be for the quadratic function. Step 1 is going to be the one that's going to be the most work. So how do I find g of x plus h? Where we see the variable x, what are you going to substitute? X plus h. So if you need to draw those little arrows, you draw those arrows. And so this becomes 3 times in parentheses. What do I put inside the parentheses? And what do I do to x plus h? Squared. Minus 7 times in parentheses. What do I put? X plus h. And then plus what? 2. Now, just like we did with numbers 1 and 2 of the review, so when I was squaring this binomial, I went off to the side and I figured out what that was, right? Okay. So I got to go off to the side and figure out what x plus h squared is. Well, remember, x plus h squared means x plus h times x plus h. Now remember, when you're squaring, when you're dealing with a quadratic function, you're always, and everyone you do, I want you to notice this, and everyone you do, you're always at some point going to square x of x plus h. So this part here will always be the same thing for all the problems we do, this part here, when you square. Because you'll be squaring x plus h. When I follow this out, what's x times x? What's the outer? Now remember, when we talked about this, when we square a binomial, the outer and the inner better be the same. What's the inner? xh, put alphabetical order. And h times h is h squared. So this right here, whenever you square x plus h, it's always going to be this. X squared plus what? xh plus xh is 2xh, right? And then plus what? H squared. So remember, 1xh plus 1xh is 2xh. So that's this right here. So this will be 3 times x squared plus 2xh plus h squared. And then let's distribute this. That's going to become what? Minus 7x minus 7h plus 2. Distribute this. That becomes 3x squared plus 6xh plus 3h squared. And then I'm going to write everything else over. So then that involves a lot more work. That's step 1. Combine like terms and you're almost done. Remember, this at this point, this is where you got to remember, if I'm doing this correctly, if I did all this part right here correct, then every term that doesn't have an h in it better cancel out with something else. So look, see this 3x squared? I better have a negative 3x squared, do I? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I forgot to subtract what? I forgot to subtract g of x. All right, so it's at that part. All right. But when we get to that point, when we get to that part, every term that doesn't have an h in it better cancel out. All right, so we got to subtract g of x. All right, so step 2 would be this part here, which is what? I just found, right? That's this. All right, so I'm just writing this over. Now I'm going to subtract. What do I need to subtract now?
G of x.
G of x. We got to put that in parentheses. So in parentheses, what do I write though? What is g of x?
3x squared.
3x squared
Minus 7x.
minus 7x plus 2. It was right here, right?
Right.
All right, let's get rid of these parentheses now. So it becomes 3x squared plus 6xh plus 3h squared minus 7x minus 7h plus 2. And then all this becomes what?
Negative
3x squared
plus 7x.
plus 7x minus 2. Now it's at this point that the terms that don't have an x in it, an h in it, better cancel out. So this 3x squared, there better be a negative 3x squared in there, is. This has an h, this has an h, this does not. Do you see a positive 7x anywhere?
Yes.
Yep. This has an h, this does not. The constant 2. Do you see a negative 2 somewhere? So all you have left then is this. 6xh plus 3h squared minus 7h. So 6xh plus 7h squared plus 3h squared minus 7h. Step 2. Now this part represents what part, this expression right here represents what part of the difference quotient? The numerator. So step 3 is to take this numerator, 6xh plus 3h squared minus 7h, and then divide by what? H. Now, there are two things you can do at this point, because you got to simplify this. There are two things you can do. You can notice that the numerator, this polynomial, I can factor out an h. You see that?
Yes.
And then that h will divide into that h. So let's do that approach first. So I can factor out an h. So when you factor in an h, you also you're going to get 6x. There are two factors of h here. When I factor one of them, I'm only left with how many? 1, and then minus 7. All divided by what? H. And then I can reduce these out. So what do I get?
6x plus 3h minus 7.
Yeah. So the difference quotient of g of x, which equals 3x squared minus 7x plus 2, is blank. What goes in the blank? 6x plus 3h minus 7. All right. So it's always going to be that way when you're dealing with polynomial functions in the quadratic one. Now remember, the other way to do it, see how we factor out the h? You could have also done this. So I'm going to write it as r. You could have taken, how many terms are in the numerator? No, how many terms? 3. So I can take each of those terms and divide by the denominator. So in other words, 6xh divided by what? H. Plus 3h squared divided by h. Minus 7h divided by h. And then reduce. So when I reduce, you see those h's divide out here? What's left? I can reduce one of these, and what's left? Plus 3h, and then these divide out, what's left? Minus 7. All right, so either approach is fine. But notice there's a whole page to do a quadratic one. All right, so let's do one more with a quadratic one. Okay, so this is going to be number 3. Number 3. Let's suppose this time that I'm going to go ahead and use f. F of x is negative 5x squared plus 8x minus 4. Negative 5x squared plus 8x minus 4. And directions to say find the difference quotient. That's all it's going to say. I'll give you the formula, but it'll be written in terms of f. And this function is named f of x. So what's the difference quotient? Yeah, so we got to find f of x plus h minus f of x. All that's being divided by h. So that's your difference quotient. So that's what you want to find. So when it says find the difference quotient, that's what that means. You want to find that expression. So what's step 1? Find f of x plus h. That's your most work right there. That part's the most work. So step 1 is to find f of x plus h. And it does help if you do it like step 1, step 2, step 3 like we've been doing. So when I find f of x plus h, so remember that says where we see the variable x in my function, what do I substitute? X plus h. That's what that means. So this becomes negative 5 times x plus h, but I must do what to that x plus h? Square it. Plus 8 times x plus h, right? And then minus 4. So all I did at this point was substitute. Now, you know what you have to do now. What does that got to do? I got to get rid of those parentheses, so that's going to involve a little bit of work. For this one here, that's going to involve using the FOIL method. So that's going to be x plus h times what? X plus h. Now, at some point, you're going to remember what x plus h times x plus h is, if you don't already. It's just what? X squared plus 2xh plus h squared. But if you didn't know that, then FOIL it out. What's x times x? X squared. What's the outer? xh. What's the inner? xh. And then what's the last? h squared. When I combine like terms, 1xh plus 1xh is 2xh. All right, so that's always going to be, whenever you square x plus h, and whenever you have a quadratic, you're going to have to do that part, it's always going to be this. But this trinomial has to be multiplied by what number? -5. So let's go ahead and write that in. So that's -5 times, in parentheses, x squared plus 2xh plus h squared, right? Now let's go ahead and distribute this one. That's going to be plus 8x plus 8h minus 4. Now get rid of these parentheses, use distributive property. I'm going to get -5x squared. And then what does that become? -10xh. And then what? -5h squared. And we'll just rewrite everything else. So plus 8x plus 8h minus 4. So that was step 1. Now remember, that's a pretty long polynomial here. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this had 6 terms in it. But this polynomial expression, this polynomial represents what part of the difference quotient? The first part of the numerator, right? F of x plus h. So now I got to subtract my function from it. So that's step 2. So step 2 is to take what you just found, which is this part here. So that's all of this. -5x squared minus 10xh minus 5h squared plus 8x plus 8h minus 4. You're going to subtract, and what will I subtract now? F of x. And f of x is this right here. So I'm going to subtract -5x squared plus 8x minus 4, because that's f of x, right? Get rid of the parentheses. This becomes -5x squared minus 10xh minus 5h squared plus 8x plus 8h minus 4. And then what else? Plus 5x squared, because you distribute the -1 here, minus 8x, and then plus 4. Now it's at this point, at the end of step 2, where every term that doesn't have an h in it will cancel out with something else. So -5x squared, its opposite better be there, and it is positive 5x squared. So a -5x squared and a positive 5x squared is 0. This has an h, this has an h, this does not. 8x, its opposite better be there, and it is -8x. So 8x and a -8x is 0. This has an h, this does not. -4 and a positive 4. So every term that's left better have what variable in it? H. Every term that's left better have an h in it. We're dealing with polynomials, so that's going to be the case. So it'll be -10xh minus 5h squared plus 8h. Now, what have I just found at the end of step 2? The numerator. So now let's go to step 3. So step 3, I now know my numerator of my difference quotient. It's this, -10xh minus 5h squared plus 8h. But all that's being divided by what? H. Now, you can skip some steps because in your mind you know what it looks like when you divide each of these by h. So when I divide each of those terms by h, I'm left with what? -10x. What else? Minus 5h, and then what? Plus 8. So that's your answer right there. So the difference quotient of f of x, which was this, is blank, and what goes into blank? Negative 10x minus 5h plus 8. So the one in your test, and they sometimes have this on the final, will be quadratic. So notice how much work there is, and you can easily mess up along the way, right? But you can always check yourself at this point. At this point, if you did everything correctly at this point, anything that didn't have an h in it better cancel out. So if something was misplaced around here, then probably something was not correct here. All right. Now at the end, though, don't forget that step 3. In the difference quotient, you have to divide by h. So don't forget to divide this by h, and then reduce. Okay. All right. So that was the difference quotient.